So let's do an inventory, because you said 2 or 3 very provocative things. So the first thing, you said, although it was communism, etc., etc., in terms of culture, you said it was an attempt to aestheticize the situation, but nonetheless the end result was that people were very cultured. My own personal experience, I remember I went to teach in Eastern Europe in the early 90s, and I wrote back to my colleagues at Harvard and says these were the best students I've ever had anywhere, because they were deeply cultured and very interested in learning. When I go now and teach in Eastern Europe, they like Western Europe. In my discipline in law, they're interested in making money. If I give a course even on human rights, they don't take it. If I give a course on discriminatory tax or international trade, I have 150 students. So it's a complicated statement you're making, because on the one hand it's a critique, on the other hand it's a lament. We've lost something. And then the second provocative statement you made, you said, even though there was a transition from communism to post-communism, in some deep sense nothing changed. And I just want to ask you, can you say 2 or 3 more words about that? When you say, even though it was post-communism, it wasn't a fundamental change. What do you mean by that? Because again, that's a very interesting and provocative statement.
Yeah, this is, but both of them, they are debates, they are huge debates, and with a lot of people that had debated this. And of course, when we had the moment of the fall of the communism had difficulties to be named, because most of them, they had at a certain moment they were named as a revolution, you know. And of course that it's very difficult to have this name for this moment or for this momentum, but we don't have an unanimity. For me, it's clear that it was not a transformation of the regime, so I take very much what François Furet had said about this moment. We don't see a transformation of the regime, because we cannot have a revolution, because it's not a new regime that comes. It's a return to a regime, a political regime, that it existed in practice elsewhere and existed even in our country. So we don't have a new regime that came, and this is the reason we don't have.
What do you mean when you say it's not a new regime? Because it's the same people?
Because no, it's the same political regime. It's a political regime that you know, it was established in Western countries. It's not like the French Revolution, who is going to establish another philosophy, political philosophy in practice. In this sense, it's a new regime. As it was the l'ancien régime in France that changed with the revolution. So in this kind of thinking of a revolution that François Furet had, I think that it was not to change.
So I'm the dumb one. So, but at some level it's totally different. If I look at Romanian politics now, you have a new president or prime minister every year. There's contestation, there's opposition and government, and it changes. And it looks as if people are, in some deep sense, enjoying politics because of this. Whereas before you had an authoritarian, dictatorial regime with the same person in power. Another difference is every regime has secret services, but people in Romania do not have the same fear that they had when they were living under Ceausescu. So these seem to me very fundamental, and you have a free press. You don't get chucked in prison if you say the president stinks. I was myself in Romania just a few months ago, and there was street protest, and I was impressed by the restraint of the police. I was impressed by the restraint of the police. So these seem to be pretty fundamental changes. In other words, to say that it remained the same at some deep level, you mean it remained the same, because at least outwardly, nobody is going to claim that Romanian democracy now is perfect, which democracy is perfect, and we have a problem of corruption. Maybe get to that in a minute. But I need still to understand the sense in which you mean that it remained the same.
Here we have, I think, 2 levels. So we have the theoretical levels, and we have, which is the political theory level, and we have also the practice level. And I think, you know, that how the history of Marxism started, and Kolakowski had this idea, but it's not a very difficult one. When he started history of Marxism, he said the political philosophy cannot look at a reality. It's different, cannot look so much at the reality. It has to do the history of ideas. So what I said is more in the political philosophical sense, and not, of course, in the reality sense. Because if we look to the experience, of course, there were a lot of progress in human rights. There, as you said, you know, it's a democratic regime. But what we said also is that where the communists came in Romania in 1944, we had only 1,000 communists in Romania. It was a regime that was brought from outside, and we had a kind of starting of democracy. We have a parliamentary regime in Romania during this time. So in this sense, and I think all the most of the Eastern European countries, so in this sense we said that it's a return for us, you know, it's nothing that is new, because we return to what we had said, which just started in the 30s, in practical, that we had, and we just lost it because, you know, it was a regime which was imposed from abroad.
So the continuity, you mean, was between the pre-communist and the post-communist?
The continuity was like this. But if you see, I think, you know, that every regime has his lasting, you know, at least in the 90s. And in my view, what happened is that it's the process of democratization of Eastern countries. Here it's a huge discussion. Of course, was done very much by the European Union. And the criteria that you see a lot of progress, and even in the early 90s, we have people saying that if we didn't have Eastern Europe, and now it's another provocative, I think, idea, if we don't have European Union, Eastern Europe will become a kind of Latin America. So we have Brzezinski saying this in 1990. It's clear that only European Union only Europe can make this Eastern Europe not to become Latin America. And we see that, of course, the democratization in Eastern countries were done very much by the Copenhagen criteria, but everything what was imposed. And here it's another huge discussion. But it was was in practice one of the most rapid one in transitional theory. And but still, you know, you see at the lasting end why I speak about the rule of law, because I think that the rule of law, not only in Romania, because I don't make a distinction between Romania and other countries. I don't think that we are an exceptional country in Eastern Europe. I don't make the separation between Bulgaria and Romania, and I don't believe that we have a Central Europe. I think that we have this in culture, but in reality, I think the regime were the same, and I think that the rule of law was very weak, and was very weak in communist Romania as it was in other Eastern Europe. The rule of law was very weak at the end of the communism, and what we said, what we say, and this I understood immediately, is that in the early 90s, where nobody had understood this, that among these criteria, where I have read the Copenhagen criteria in France, I understood that they don't have the rule of law. And because they had only looking at the election, they are looking to minorities much, but they don't look to something which was fundamental, how the justice is functioning and how the rule of law is functioning. And in this sense, I think that the situation in Eastern Europe in general had a little bit, the situation of the judiciary was not enough, and the rule of law in general was not enough taking into account. So in this we see that how it's a continuation. And maybe I have to answer to the first question, that both of them, they are huge. The culture, yeah.
Let's move on a little bit. So I want to ask two things. So before we started, I was speaking to the ambassador, and she told me something that struck me. I never realized that. I reached the age where I don't have to apologize for my ignorance. That's one of the advantages of getting old. So she said that under the communist regime there were no female ambassadors. One.
I said no female diplomats.
Diplomats. Even more sweeping. Even more sweeping. One token, and then females were secretaries in the mission, but never diplomats. And now she told me that maybe 55% of the fonctionnaires, we're not talking about secretaries, of the fonctionnaires of the foreign ministries here in Romania are women. So in this respect, there's been a huge change. And you yourself, you judge on the Constitutional Court, and you've represented your country in so many important fora. So the situation of women, it seems, has changed dramatically.
Yeah, this is another complicated story.
Topic of debate.
A topic of the whole debate, because in theory, the situation of the human rights in Eastern country was very much protected, but in practice it was still the tradition. Because what happened is that what is recognized is that communist regime didn't stay as legitimacy. It stopped in the late 60s. So this is the reason why nobody believed anymore in communism at the late 60s. So this is the reason why the regime was looking for new bases of legitimacy. This I call it culturalism, nationalism, and you know that it's the kind of consumerism, or the three bases, the new basis of the legitimacy of the communist regime after the 60s. And what I think about women's rights as well is because what happened is that the traditional, because these rights were not believed fully, this traditional role of women, it was still there in the society. So it was a mixture between women who were there. But for instance, in the School of Law, when I was during communism, 90% we were women. But this was the reason maybe why the judiciary was so weak. You know, the phenomena where you see, where you see a lot of women, you have to, even now, you know, you have to put this question: is this part of the world become very weak, or it's something? Because I also have the experience. I work not only that I was the youngest, but I work with men all the time. And I have a committee that I left now, the minority committee, and I see that only a lot of women were around me. So I see when a lot of women are around me, I have to leave, because all my life I had worked only with when a little bit young people come, younger than me, I have to leave. It's not my place anymore. But this is how life is how my life is going on. So when I have seen this woman and two younger people, of course it was the moment that I leave the committee. So this is the reason where I see this woman, because the committee is not so important anymore. This is the sign as well. You put women in places and you understand that this place is not very important for the state. I think the judiciary, of course, was not important for the state. And obviously this is the reason why we could have 90% of my generation were women, you know, and and here we have the complicated discussion. I think, you know, diplomats, to put it very diplomatically, they had more complex roles that the judges had at the time, and this is the reason women were not sent at the time as diplomats. But I know for sure that, generally speaking, I think, you know, it's also, you know, it's as feminist theory recognizes, it's also back and forth, you know, the rights of women. You know, you never know where this will disappear. But I think, you know, that also you can see that it was a sign of weakness, because we were at the School of Laws. But of course that after the fall of the communism, we started to have, everybody started to have new chances, and also this kind of traditional thinking about the role of the women became a little bit different, because in my view at least, we don't have enough, you know, gender study. We don't have even ideas, because everything starts with ideas. I think that the first gender program at the University of Bucharest was established only last year, so this is something. It is the main university in the country we had visited, and the biggest one, and we have a gender program established after 20 years after the fall of the communism, the first one, and it's in French, by the way, the program. So
now, if you look at Eastern Europe as a whole, as you said, so not a focus on Romania, do you detect there's still some kind of identity that differentiates it from Western Europe? And in particular, so you talked about the weakness in the rule of law, and that's the usual image in the West, in Western Europe, that those Easterners have to catch up. So we see a microcosm of that in Germany itself, even 25 years after unification. It's still Ossis and Wessis and these resemblance. And then the same thing plays in a macro, the whole of Europe, there's Western Europe, and it's a narrative of they have to catch up. The rule of law is not so good, and the economy is not so good, blah, blah, blah. But what I'm interested in, what you were saying before, can you articulate an identity contemporary, which is still Eastern Europe, and also features of it which are not catching up with the West, but which maybe the West should catch up with them. What is the unique contribution of that distinct identity, if you think one still exists?
Yeah. Now again, this is something that I remember very well, because it's what I have to catch up, and I don't believe in this catch-up theory. I think that for practical political purposes, the catch-up theory, I think it's kind of empty theory. And why I believe this? I believe this because I don't separate so much the two spaces. We don't have now, as you said before, the new students in Eastern Europe, they look exactly like the Western students. I don't think. On the other side, we see a lot of islands on non-rule of law here and everywhere. I think this is another very interesting thing, that we don't have enough reflection even in the philosophy of law. And you know very well, because you have at NYU you had by yourself with Professor Ginsburg, you had this debate about international law, but on the other side you had this seminar of philosophy of law. And I was looking, in this work in the night, I was looking all the time to somebody to have something related to what became the rule of law now, and we see maybe something in the Teubner theory about this, and what the law started to be. So in contemporary, not only in Eastern, this is the only reason I don't believe in the catch-up theory very much. And regarding the identity, I think it's very difficult to say that it's very fragmented. I think that maybe still for my generation we have an identity, so I can recognize. Now I was working at an agency against discrimination, so I have seen one of my colleagues in Slovenia. He is younger than me, and we realized that of course he's the first one who raised to me this question. No, we still have the identity, and this identity, as you said, it is given by culture. Again, I came back there, and I came back to the other thing that I didn't spoke before, because as you said, this has as you see all these dilemmas when you analyze a philosopher as a Heidegger, because you see all these dilemmas about the human being, about the economic transformation, all this alienation theory that was tackled by Heidegger after this political philosophy that he incorporated with him. But you see all this dilemma there, what you are going to choose in order to have still, the being, what you are going to do. And even if in Eastern country this was an option that maybe in Romania was less ethic than aesthetical, and it was in Czech Republic with the Charter 77, where Patočka changed a little bit this whole philosophy of Heidegger into an ethical movement. Even if it was like this in Eastern country, we still have this identity. We still have our generation's identity, and I think maybe in this way, it is still, because we are still there. It's something that they could catch up with us. I don't know if we speak about catch up, but I don't think in catch up. I think they can interact with us because they have to learn this for us.
I'm pessimist, because it's not a question of them catching up with you. It might be a question of you falling down to them, your standards dropping. And that's been my experience as a teacher. Do you mind if we come a little bit closer to the book? So, in the book, you draw a big distinction, and it's reflected in the structure of the book. You compare the conception, the doctrines of international law in the West, that's one part of the book, and the doctrine of international law in the East, where actually the communist regimes. Could you maybe in 2 or 3 minutes tell us the biggest difference. How, since the book is divided into this, so it means it's a relevant distinction. So how would you define the difference between the doctrines, communist doctrines, as developed in the West, and communist doctrines developed in the East? What's the big difference? How would you articulate that?
There are big differences, and it's as you had seen in the book. It's what we have in Western countries. It's kind of an international law, and because it's very difficult to conciliate the pure Marxist theory, because it's as you know very well, it's a non-state theory. So this is the big dilemma of the international law: what to do with a theory that postulated the non-state and how to apply it. And as people characterize, for example, Charles Jouannet in France and École de Reims, it was more a militantism, that it was inspired, by, it was an analysis inspired by the Marxist, but it was not anymore the idea of revolution. And this distinction is very well done. Is very well done in political philosophy between the Marxist and what you call the neo-Marxist theory, like it's at the time we speak about Marcuse and all the Frankfurt school and all the theory that they have. So this distinction it's made in political philosophy, and it's the distinction between the Marxist of even the political party who were Marxist in Western countries. They gave up to the idea of a revolution, and they passed, at least at the late 60s, they passed to the idea of a pacific revolution, so to a communist regime. So we see that it's the communism, of course, in Western countries was a Euro communism, known as this name, was different comparing to what happened in Eastern in doctrines in Eastern country. What happened in doctrine in Eastern country, because Marxism was nowhere at the end of the day. This is the paradox. Pure Marxism was nowhere, or even Marxism was not there, because it stood. Because in Western countries we see this kind of neo-Marxist theory. They have without a revolution. And in Eastern country, what we see, it's less that a Marxist-Leninism. We see a kind of empty propaganda that I have spoken before.
But how is it reflected in? Can you actually give us? Is it possible to give a concrete example from some doctrine of international law that you would say in the West this is how they talked about it, and in the East this is how they talked about it, so that we could really feel this difference in relation to a doctrine of international law, and yet both claiming to be Marxist?
Yeah, I think that the differences are in what they have. I'll start what they had in common very much. Of course, they had in common kind of approach to economic, social, and cultural rights in the 60s that was very much in common of two. And what they have in common is the analysis of the power structure. So it's the power, the infrastructure, how the power it works, the concrete analysis of the society. That it was very much Marxist. But this was, if you want, in my view at least, if I have to read Jouannet or other Marxists, at the time, it's at his school basically, or other Euro international law. I see the difference between him, because it's more something that it's kind of militantism, and in Eastern country the doctrine became very severe. For instance, they said all the time that the state, not Jean Baudin, for instance, in Latvia there were authors, and in Lithuania there were authors who stated that it was Estonia it was not the Jean Baudin who invented, but there was some counselor of the Ivan IV who had invented, in fact, the idea of state. So we see this kind of very primitive protagonism that we have. Everything started with us. that replaced, and they became very nationalist. And this is one feature, if you want, of the theory of state. We see on the other side, if you want, in a more evaluated, because you have to make a distinction between some very more respectable, if I think, international lawyers as maybe Pashukanis or afterwards Tunkin, and the late generation. The late generation were only Diamat and the pure propaganda. So you know, if you want, in the most evaluated international lawyer as Tunkin, we see that for him, as sources in international law, the general principle of law, they were not considered to be, as we consider in West, the principle of Western countries, the most civilized nation, because of course they don't like this expression, but not only this, but this principle were for them the principle adopted in 1970s at the General Assembly. So it's a completely different vision about this principle that they have in West. Of course, it's also the custom. They had a different interpretation. As you know, they were more oriented to the treaties than to custom and the other sources of law. So we see in this that the others, even if they are critical, they are not saying that these sources doesn't exist. They don't replace the general principle. They just criticize, and they want them to have established something. Of course, what they have also in common, and here it's another big discussion. It's what happened in the Third World at the time, and colonialism and post-colonialism. And here it's still a way where we see the Marxists of today, you know, that they concentrate a lot.
I think it would be a good time now to open the floor for other people to ask Iulia Motoc any questions or make comments on what she said.
Actually, thank you very much for understanding the spirit, because I really think that there were a few provocative thoughts that were expressed here. And having given you the modesty of Professor Weiler, I would encourage you, my dear colleagues, to ask questions also to Professor Weiler. Because of course he just withdrew, you know, in the shadow of our main speaker. But I would love you to take a profit of this occasion too, if you want, of course. If not, we will continue this conversation. But I really appreciate the fact that you give to our audience the possibility to express their, I don't know, comments or to ask some questions, especially because there are a few colleagues of ours who are from very different corners of the world. And we're very curious to see how they process all this.
No, I don't think they should also. They are the most welcome to put questions to Professor Weiler.
Yes, please.
Hello, thank you very much for organizing this event, which is really refreshing in this environment. I'm Salvatore Zappala from the Italian Mission. I have actually two questions, which I think are also curiosities in a way. On the one hand, you referred to a rule of law which was very weak under the communist regime, but was also the role of law very weak. The role of law both at domestic level, law as an instrument, if you want, maybe even in a sense which can be negative, but law can be used as an instrument, and also at the international level in the relationship with the other side of the world or other states. And the other question relates to the comment you made about the analysis of power. Do you think there still is some value in the analysis of power which was embodied in the communist doctrines of international law and international relations? Thank you.
So it's thank you very much for the questions. The first question I remember because you know we have this discussion as a very, we start with a very common sense discussion. You know, we have in Romanian a famous book written by Alexander Paleologu, The Promise as a Paradox, that was very much read during communists about books. And I remember when I made the first, we had published in I think think 1996 in Romania, 1997, we had published in Romania a new edition of the manifesto of the Communist Party with my colleagues. And I have written to this new edition because we had commented the manifesto. And at this stage, you know, I found something very, not only which was the place of law in the Marxist theory that you know very well, that law is considered a superstructure that doesn't have the same value as the others, the same value that the other structures, you know, they have, it's a superstructure. But also I had discovered something very interesting regarding Marx himself, because I have read the letters that Marx had written to his father was he was studying law, because you know very well that Marx was studying law. So he said he was so unhappy to study law himself because he wanted to study literature. He said, all my life I wanted to study poetry, you know, and now I am just with this very arid law. What I am going to do? So we see that Marx himself, he hates law, and maybe it's not only his analysis to power, but it's his individual way, his own life that always, you know, shape a mind of a philosopher. We see this as a lot of people, this poor young Marx, going to the school of law and wanted to study poetry. And I think, you know, this instead of law. And I think, you know, we see very much even in the Marxist doctrine that law is a superstructure. So here my answer will be yes, from an end to another, because it's the Marxist theory as such, the pure Marxist theory, you know, what it can be something more concentrated, that you see in the Capital, we see everywhere, you know, these theories about the rule of the law, but it's very well known. But afterwards, you see in practice as well. Why? Because you see in practice because the communist state cannot control anymore. It's the rule of every totalitarian state, you know, because you see, you know, Arendt had made this statement very much, and I think she was very much right. Use totalitarian law, they cannot control until the end. They start to lose control. And you see the communist state in the 60s, 70s started to lose control. This is the reason why on the economic side you see new incipient way of capitalism, you know, and I say consumerism, because the planified economy doesn't exist anymore. You see some form of kind of that is not respected anymore. It exists, but it's not respected. And this is the reason why the rule of law was cannot be strong in a totalitarian regime. Arendt was saying this very clearly, because a totalitarian state cannot control cannot control things, and it became a weak state. And this is the paradox of this totalitarianism, if you want, a long distance. And as it was the communism, you know, and even here we have different classification, because there are some political scientists say that it was more authoritarian regime after the 60s and not totalitarian. But anyway, this kind of state cannot control. So this is the reason why rule of law is weak. Speaking about international law here, I think that international law very much transformed for Marxist theory, you know, very much, because it's a denial, as this was the dilemmas of Marxists in general, what to do, because you have to abolish the state, so they have to very much to adopt the Leninist and to accept the state. This was the first step that was done by Bashukanis and by others in the 20s regarding the theory of Marxists. They were real Marxists, because afterwards they became very much integrated. So it's I think, you know, that international law became very much simplified. And when I had spoken about Tunkin here, I think he was the main philosopher. He had courses at the main international law, the world wide law. He had courses at the Hague, and still, you know, we see in some manuals of even contemporary one in Eastern countries. Here's the theory of Tunkin, and I think it was a quite rigid one. You know, it became a little bit more